Often on the show, you'll find me trying to compare two vastly different ideologies and try to figure out how they really come together or what they really have in common. But in addition, as Omnists, we try to figure out why different ideologies don't get along. What's the real problem between them? And for now, we're going to talk very loosely about believers and non-believers. Non-believers, very loosely, being, shall we say, a certain ilk of atheist who only gets his or her view of the universe and reality through science, through what can be experimented on in a particular way, through what they can see and touch and smell and taste, etc., versus the believer, who could loosely be, Jews, Hindus, Christians, Muslims, anyone who gains their view of reality through Holy Writ or through God, either directly or indirectly, through mystical experience, however you want to put that. And what I've found about the two of them is that ultimately, in many ways, it just comes down to what the criteria is of their own personal belief system. The scientifically minded person, the non-believer, for instance, will look at the believer and say, well, you don't even make any sense. These are the facts. This is what happened. I can look back and look at what science has said about A, B, C, and D, and this is what happened. These are the facts. What you say doesn't make any sense. You're living in a fantasy land. Now, of course, what's really happening there is that the non-believer has a particular criteria for what he feels is true. He believes that in science, and science works, as I've said before, in a very particular way. It works with what can be experimented on, what can be studied, what can come through the five senses, and studied in a particular way, and it is a certain way of reading the evidence, and not to mention a certain type of evidence that they study. Whereas on the other hand, the believer is completely the opposite. They feel that for whatever reason, the information that they are getting from the deep past, from holy writs, from God, through personal experience, through just plain intuition, is somehow superior to what these other people gain through their type of study, their way, should I say, of reading the evidence. And this is why ultimately they have trouble getting together on things, is that no matter what, they simply have different criteria for what truth is. And if my Bible appears to say, for whatever reason, that the Bible is 6,500 years old, then it must be. And the scientists simply are wrong. And of course, science has its particular way, and regardless of the fact that science changes constantly, for a while there, they thought the universe, or rather our world, was several 100,000 years old, then it was a few million years old, then it was many millions of years old, and now I think it's about 4.5 billion. And in another couple hundred years, it could be 6, it could be 12 billion years old. We have no idea, because science does come to more and more understandings of the way that it reads the evidence. And of course, it's entirely possible that one of these days, science could wake up and go, oh my goodness, it is 6,500 years old. We were wrong all this time. And it's literally possible. You know, the old last week theory that reality doesn't have to have existed any more than a few seconds ago. Reality could have been created just a moment ago, the entire world made exactly the way it is, to appear exactly the way it is, at the age that it appears. You could be imprinted with memories of your entire life so that you think you were born, even though you didn't exist past a few seconds ago. All of that is theoretically possible. But the bottom line is, as I said, we're just talking about different criteria. To me, what is most advantageous is if the non-believer is able to look at the believer's point of view and say, well, okay, we appear to have a very good way of reading the evidence. But on the other hand, I'm not going to dismiss all of this knowledge that is built up over the last thousands and thousands and thousands of years. I think science has a tendency, or perhaps should I say, this particular non-believer mindset has a tendency to just throw everything away in the past. They say, well, the only reason that people ever believed these nonsensical supernatural things is because they needed something. They needed something to explain everything. They needed a God, so they made a God. And the only reason that they're all so similar is just because they all had similar needs. And to me, that's really kind of a cop-out. It's just sort of sweeping the past under the carpet. And especially considering there could be a great deal of extremely useful knowledge that could be used to further science. Ultimately, we may not be sure exactly how that might work yet, but I think one day it could. On the other hand, I think that the believer very much needs to be able to look at science and say, well, science is coming to realize A, B, C, and D. And so perhaps, I'm not saying that that my holy writs are wrong. I'm not saying that what God said was wrong. I'm not saying what was said several thousand years ago was wrong, but perhaps we don't entirely understand what it was saying. Perhaps it was more metaphorical. Perhaps the 6,500 years from the Old Testament wasn't entirely literal. And I really think that both of those sides could get much further, and ultimately, if they could work together, they could get even further to understand what the actual truth is. But it's very difficult when both sides are simply locking their heels in and going purely by that criteria that they think is the ultimate criteria. One, my God is right, and the other one, well, my evidence is right. For whatever all of that is worth. I'm the Urban Omnist, hopefully helping us take a step or two forward. And, of course, non-believers who will loosely, obviously the two can coexist peacefully, just like fish. Oftentimes you'll hear me, I have no problem with that. Most computers hate me. All computers hate me. They always have. Ever since I stepped on that cord when I was 4 years old, and computers never forgiven me. I don't blame it, really. I didn't like it either. It used to make fun of me. Called me a dork. You know what it's like to have a computer call you a dork? Seriously. It's like having electricity make fun of Tesla. Guess we better redo that one. And remember, guys, none of this works without you. So, subscribe to our channel, like us on Facebook and Twitter, and above all, don't forget to send me those questions.